Now, next case, Middlesex Education Association versus the Middlesex County Board of Education. Um, Here there was a question about the assignment of teacher duties. And it came down to a very small provision about the language of the contract in which teachers were allowed to be assigned a certain number of teaching periods, duty periods. But the contract didn't say anything about a duty post. So the question is, what's a teaching period, assigned teaching period, and assigned to a teaching post? And for years and years in the district, teaching period involved actually handling students, being responsible for them and providing an education or instruction to those students. A teaching post was simply being on post and doing hall duty, maybe cafeteria duty, and everyone understood that practice. So because the contract didn't assign the number of posts, or didn't speak to the number of posts that could be assigned, the board actually won out in this litigation. And it was allowed to assign as many posts as they felt was appropriate or had to negotiate something different with the union. And I'm sure the next round of negotiations will include that conversation on duty posts versus duty periods. Richter versus Oakland Board of Education is actually not a happy case, because here we have a teacher who was suffering from a condition. She was a diabetic, and because of her diabetes, obviously you need to maintain your blood sugar and you need to eat at certain times. This teacher was assigned a late lunch period, was actually in class and teaching up through 6th period, so she couldn't eat until 7th period during the course of the school day. During the first marking period, she complained to the building principal and said, I really need to eat earlier than that. Can you make arrangements or an accommodation that allows me to eat earlier during the school day? So for the second marking period, the building principal assigned her to an earlier lunch period, and that was working out fine. But for the third marking period, either the building principal forgot or didn't care, probably forgot, and assigned her back to the late lunch period. And the teacher, instead of going to the building principal and saying, last marking period we had me earlier and we talked about, my need to eat during the school day, can you reassign me back to the early lunch period? She didn't say a word. She just shouldered on and took the assignment. Unfortunately, one day late in the year, I believe it was May, the teacher, her blood sugar dropped and she passed out in the classroom. And she suffered some substantial injuries. The decision doesn't actually say, but she must have fallen and hit her face on a desk because she required extensive oral surgery, lost her sense of taste and her sense of smell, and had a number of other injuries because of the fall. And ultimately, she argued that she was suffering a shortened lifespan because of her injuries. So because of that, she filed a claim against the school district, failure to accommodate her disability, her diabetic condition. And the school district moved to dismiss that case because according to the law, if you're trying to prove that the board discriminated against you because of your disability, you have to show that the board acted intentionally. And there was an adverse employment action. Here, there was no adverse employment action. She didn't lose any money. She wasn't assigned to a lesser desirable position. All that happened is she was denied the lunch period that would have best suited her. Number one. And number two, the district argued that this teacher also had an obligation, or at least the ability, to mitigate her own loss by either taking a snack with her, an orange or an apple or something, or coming back to the building principal and saying, look, we had an understanding. At least I thought we had an understanding. Can you move me back to the earlier lunch? She did neither. So the board moved for dismissal. The court in this case said, no, we're not going to dismiss the case at this time, because there are occasions where even without the board showing, or without the teacher showing that the board acted and imposed an adverse employment consequence on her, it's possible that she suffered a disability, suffered some injuries due to the board's failure to accommodate her condition. And it looks like this might be the rare case where there is no adverse employment action, but there is a failure to accommodate. So the court allowed the case to move forward. But what's also important about this case is there's a claim of punitive damages here, in that if she can claim that the building principal was either willfully or negligent and disregarded her condition, then punitive damages could be awarded. And if a jury was to award punitive damages, we don't know what the jury might do. The jury might say $10,000, might say $100,000. So you want to try to avoid that kind of situation. So administration should be aware that if there is an accommodation request, they should pay attention to that and do everything they can to accommodate that request. But at the same time, the employee has an obligation to come forward too and make sure that the request is understood. And if it's not being accommodated, make sure that they make that known so an accommodation can be made. There is an obligation on both parties to comply. Now, Manful versus Trenton Board of Education was an interesting case because here the board had appointed individuals to a stipend position, the boys basketball coach. In this case, they appointed a substitute teacher to that position. Apparently, when the board appointed this substitute, his teaching credential, his sub-certificate, had expired. And we know that you can't have a person in a position who's serving under an expired certificate. So the board had to let that person go. Next in line was Mr. Manful, who was a certified teacher and had applied for the basketball coaching position, but the board didn't award him that position. The board left the position vacant. Once the substitute got his substitute credential renewed and reinstated, the board then appointed him to that position. And Mr. Manful said, hey, wait, you can't do that. He wasn't qualified. Plus, I'm a certified teacher. You can't put a person in place who is not certified. So the issue was that the substitute certificate had expired. At the time that the sub-certificate had expired, regulations required that in order for a board to appoint a substitute to a stipend position, the board had to demonstrate that there was no eligible or qualified individuals. And Mr. Manful's argument was he was certified, he was qualified, he should have been appointed to that position, especially because the substitute was not certified. And the board shouldn't have left the position vacant, they should have filled it with Mr. Manful. But in this case, between the time that the substitute was withdrawn from his position, the regulations changed. And the new regulation stated that there was no obligation on the board's part to demonstrate that there were no other qualified individuals before they could appoint a substitute. So once the sub got his new substitute credentials, the board was allowed, pursuant to regulation, to appoint him, and that's what they did. So Mr. Manful unfortunately lost out on his case because of the change in regulations. Now, next case, moving forward, Nash versus the Board of Examiners. Here we have an alternate route teacher who was going for his teaching certificate, but was unable to complete that at the time. And when he did complete his requirements to finish up the certification, the Board of Examiners said, the certification requirements have now changed and you don't meet the new standards. Makes sense, right? If you start the process, the regulations change before you complete the process, you have to complete the new standards, the new requirements in addition. But Mr. Nash had a good argument. He said that, yes, I understand that I should have completed it in a timely fashion, but I couldn't because I was in jail. I spent 22 years in jail, but I was wrongfully convicted. And actually, I can prove I was wrongfully convicted because not only was I released from jail, my criminal record was expunged. And had the state not wrongfully convicted me, I would have completed my teaching certification in a timely fashion 22 years ago. So because the state made a mistake back then, I'm being punished twice now by being denied my teaching certification. The examiner said, Mr. Nash, that's unfortunate that the state did that to you, but we can't help you. We have to ensure that the students that are being taught by appropriately certified individuals, and that means you have to have up-to-date credentials and meet the new standards. So the interests of the students outweigh the needs of the teacher, and even though he was treated unfairly by the state for 22 years at least, Board of Examiners didn't buy his argument and didn't give him his teaching certification. Now, what we've also seen recently, the next couple of cases are going to demonstrate this, hopefully fairly quickly, is that boards are looking for ways to save money in almost every way they can because of some of the cuts that they've been suffering. And in DeGraff versus Belleville, that's what we see, that a board decided that they had to RIF a dance teacher because they just were running out of money. The dance teacher said that you can't RIF me. I'm the only dance teacher in the district. And without me providing dance instruction, you don't have a dance program anymore. And NCLB standards require that you provide dance instruction, and the state standards require dance instruction. Well, what the commissioner determined was that the standards require a dance program in middle school and high school. A dance program and dance instruction, they're two different things. So the commissioner said because they are two different things, that the district can go ahead and do what they need to do with regard to that position as long as the students get, as long as the district fulfills its requirements for dance toward those students. And as to NCLB, the commissioner said, well, that's not under my jurisdiction. I don't do federal law. That's got to be filed in a court. So Ms. DeGraff lost her argument. Same type of thing happened in High Point when a student assistance coordinator was also RIFed by the district, but he had what he thought was a stronger argument. It said the statute requires, not just a regulation, not just NCLB, but the state statute requires an SAC coordinator, student assistance coordinator in every district. It's written right there in the language. Here, the court said, the commissioner said, yes, that's correct. The statute does require a student assistance coordinator in every district, but it doesn't require an actual coordinator position. It requires the coordinator services be provided. It doesn't say who's going to provide those services. And as long as the services are provided by someone who is certified, it doesn't have to be an employee. What the statute does say, Ms. Romeo argued, the statute does say that the person has to be appointed. And the statute actually does say that. But that's only for the first 5 years of the Student Assistance Coordinator program. And that was during the voluntary pilot program. After the first 5 years of the program, because it was discretionary as to appointing the individual, the board didn't have to keep that person employed as long as they made sure that the services were provided. So that's what happened with Romeo and High Point. Now, Greenman versus Board of Examiners. We have a teacher here who had been, I believe, a welder in his professional life, working for his company, applied for a teaching certification, and one of the requirements is you have to demonstrate 8,000 hours over the past 10 years of actual employment in the field, which sounds like a lot, but really it's only 15 hours a week. So Mr. Greenman said, I'm doing more than 8,000 hours. You can see that here. But one of the problems was during the last 4 years of his employment, he was employed as a welding instructor. And the regulations discount any time provided or any time that you serve as a teacher or an instructor. And because Mr. Greenman was teaching his coworkers, his younger workers, in a teaching position inside his company, he wasn't given any credit for that, for those years serving as a teacher. So even though he had more than enough hours, many of those hours were spent training people how to weld, which you would think would be exactly what you would want in the classroom, someone who knows not just how to do it, but how to teach it as well. But here, the commissioner said, no, you don't meet the standards. So Mr. Greenman lost his case. So the next case I'm going to talk about is Gomez versus Elizabeth Board of Education, which has a long and tortured history, which I'm not going to go into. But suffice it to say that Ms. Gomez was not a model employee. Over the past 10 years of her employment, she was absent roughly 970 days. So 97 days a year, she was out. But she said she had chronic back issues, and that prevented her from being at work every day, which is understandable in some cases, but you got to go to work, right? So the last year or so that she was employed by the district, she was in a non-pay status, meaning that they had her on the rolls, but of course they're not paying her salary because she's not performing any services. Toward the end of that period, the board said, well, we're not paying her. Do we have to continue to pay her health benefits, her health care premiums? And the board stopped because she wasn't providing services. Ms. Gomez argued that she was still employed. She was a tenured secretary, still employed by the district, and as long as she was employed, then she should be entitled to receive the benefits of her employment, which included health care payments. And the administrative law judge who heard the case initially agreed with Mrs. Gomez and required the district to pay her COBRA payments for 7 or 8 months or so. The board, rightfully so, appealed this case the case went before the commissioner. It wasn't an actual appeal. The case went before the commissioner, who looked at the case with Ms. Gomez and the health care benefits and said, health care benefits are paid pursuant to a collective negotiations agreement. They have nothing to do with tenure. So your tenure rights are to continued employment. And even though the board probably should have filed tenure charges against you, they weren't required to do so. Nor were they required to continue to pay your health care benefits. The board stopped paying your salary because you weren't working. They can also stop paying your health care benefits. So that just made sense and was a victory for the board in this case. They're rare, but we'll take them when we can find them. Corcoran versus Queen City Charter doesn't happen too often, but there is a state statute that says that you cannot make a teacher teach on a state holiday. And in this particular case, Queen City Charter had an in-service day on a state holiday. Mr. Greenman said he wasn't coming in because it was a state holiday, and the charter school docked his pay 1 day for that failure. Mr. Corcoran objected, filed an action before the commissioner. The commissioner said, Mr. Corcoran's right, you can't force a teacher to work on a state holiday, so they had to reinstate that 1 day that the district docked him. Merida versus Union County. In this case, a bedside instructor of 7 years, I believe, argued that she was entitled to tenure and had gained tenure in that position because she'd been a bedside instructor for more than 3 years and a day, and therefore was qualified, eligible for tenure. When the district riffed that position, she claimed that they couldn't, when the district dismissed her, they claimed that they couldn't do that because she was tenured. Commissioner decided that she was acting in place of the regular teacher. And we know that anyone who's in an acting position doesn't gain tenure because that time doesn't accrue towards tenure, because you expect the person to return to their position. In this case, Ms. Murda argued that she wasn't acting because the teacher wasn't there. There was no teacher to actually go out to the house and provide instruction. But the commissioner said, yes, that's true, but here the teacher wouldn't have been allowed to go out, and the student wasn't available at the time, so the teacher had to go to the house. So the teacher wasn't absent, wasn't that the teacher was not providing services, it's that the student wasn't there. So since the teacher wasn't acting in place of, because there was no vacancy, tenure time, the time toward tenure did not accrue. So again, teacher didn't gain tenure, and there's a victory for the board.